As we continue with our discussion on the nervous system, we move to the WIDS objectives part 2. We're going to identify the role of neurotransmitters, correlate cranial nerves to their respective physiological functions, relate higher order brain functions to brain anatomy, and relate various types of pain to homeostatic mechanism. Now, all of that sounds like a mouthful to me. So basically what we're going to do is talk a little bit about neurotransmitters, the different types of neurotransmitters. We're going to look at cranial nerves a little bit. I know those of you who were with me in general, we looked briefly at the different cranial nerves. So maybe kind of a review. I'm not going to spend a heck of a lot of time on that section. And then the next one, number 3, is simply higher order brain functions. So we would think of like thought, memory, perception of pain, perception in general, coming from the cerebrum, of course. So that's basically saying we're going to look at the cerebrum and some of the functions of the different areas of the cerebrum. That's all it's saying. And then lastly is pain. We'll talk a little bit about pain. So let's get going with neurotransmitters. Simply, well, first of all, it's another type of chemical in the body. Next chapter or the next section we do is going to be on the endocrine system or hormones. So we know that hormones are a type of chemical in the body. We've heard the word enzymes at some point. We'll hear that again throughout the semester. That's another type of chemical in the body. And now here we see neurotransmitters. So and just another fancy name for a chemical. We're going to analyze in the next chapter on endocrine the kind of the difference between a neurotransmitter and a hormone. So anyways, introduction to a few of the neurotransmitters. These are basically chemicals of the nervous system, and they're going to be responsible for communicating with other neurons or with glands or other muscle cells or other types of tissue cells. So the means by which neurons communicate with one another. But again, we do see neurotransmitters communicating with muscles and other types of tissues. So over 50 different types of just over 50 different neurotransmitters. Again, neurotransmitter or hormone. So again, hormone, we're thinking coming from a gland and being secreted into the blood supply or into the cardiovascular system, whereas neurotransmitters generally, again, are going to be directly between a neuron and another neuron. So an axon and a dendrite. We looked at synapses at the end of the last unit. So anyway, we do have a couple different types of neurotransmitters. I'm not going to get into too much of this detail. Really, the reason I put this up here is to show you a lot of the activity that's going on at the cell membrane. And again, outside of the cell, we see a lot more sodium. Inside the cell, we see a lot more potassium. So this would be probably a cell that is in a state of being at rest. So we would say that this is a polarized situation, for example. So this is also shown. So you have the phospholipid bilayer here with the integral membrane proteins. Those could be channels or pumps, pores, some method of passing something into the cell or out of the cell. So we have those leak channels. Remember those from part 1. These are the leak channels. So again, when we're polarized, we do have a little bit of leakage of sodium in and maybe a little bit of leakage of potassium out. But the other thing I wanted to mention and why we're looking at this is the neurotransmitter binding site. So we do see some of these channels are operated in essence by the presence of a neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters behave as sort of like a key to unlock the channel. So we do see some neurotransmitters have a direct relationship with these channels, these sodium or potassium leak channels. So if we start to get some sort of a stimulus where we're seeing depolarization start to occur, oftentimes it's because the neurotransmitter has plugged in to the sodium leak channels and enabled more sodium to start rushing in to the cell. So anyway, neurotransmitters. We can classify neurotransmitters in a few different ways. How do we classify them? Just like most stuff in A&P, oftentimes the classification boils down to the function. So these are functional classifications, as well as based on the structure of the chemical that's involved. So we do have 4 classes of neurotransmitters. The first class is what we call the acetylcholine class. It's the only chemical or neurotransmitter in that class. So the reason that it's in a class all by itself is because it doesn't possess properties that would allow it to be placed in any of the other 3 categories. So, so anyway, acetylcholine, the amine group, the amino acid group. And we'll look at we'll look at all 4 of these when we get to and then the neuropeptide group. For some reason it had cut off, so I wanted to pull that up for you. So that's the 4th group. We'll talk about that one quite a bit. But let's back up to acetylcholine. So we're going to see acetylcholine quite a bit when we get to the muscular system. We're going to look at neuromuscular connections and how does a muscle contract. So probably in about, I don't know, maybe 4 weeks from now. So this one will pop up again. It has a unique chemical structure. That's why it's in a class by itself. It's what we call an acetate with a choline. So that's where it gets its name. And again, that's organic chemistry that you're not going to have to worry about the finer details, maybe just knowing that acetylcholine is unique and it's by itself when we categorize neurotransmitters. So primarily, we see acetylcholine located in the synaptic knobs or the axon terminal at a neuromuscular junction. That's a lot of gibberish, but basically what it's saying is, or what I'm saying is, when a nerve plugs into a muscle, at the end of this nerve, we're going to see storage of acetylcholine. And when we need the muscle to contract, we're going to have to release some of that acetylcholine into the muscle. And we'll look at that instead of my hands. We'll actually see this going on when we get to the neuromuscular junction and how we get a muscle to contract here in a couple of weeks. So typically we think of acetylcholine as being excitatory or getting something to happen. It can be inhibitory as well, or getting something to slow down or stop. The second neurotransmitter type, it's the amine group, and we maybe kind of recognize that term a little bit, or at least part of it. We see amine in there, amino acid. So this is going to have nitrogen involved. It's going to have protein or be associated with protein derivatives. Okay. So again, we're going to see 2 different categories of the amines. What we call the monoamines and the catecholamines. The amine group is located primarily the neurotransmitters within the brain. We think of this group as kind of the feel-good chemicals, the pain relieving chemicals, mood enhancing chemicals, potentially inflammatory processes that occur due to pain are going to trigger some of the amines to start functioning. Okay, so serotonin, histamine, dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine. So anyway, you see the word amine in histamine, dopamine. So kind of a giveaway that we're dealing with a neurotransmitter that's in that amine group. So histamine, dopamine. So again, found in the brain, typically we think of learning, mood, emotions, motor control associated with those. Okay. And then the third neurotransmitter in the small molecule group are the amino acids. So these are probably the most common types of neurotransmitters within the central nervous system. And then we see within the peripheral, so the brain and spinal cord, within the peripheral nervous system, we're going to see amino acids, again, often stored in those axon terminals, what we call the synaptic vesicles. These are little tiny vehicles or within the synaptic knob or within the end of what we call the presynapse or the presynaptic knob. Well, vesicles are just little containers or vehicles that store chemicals and move them around. So that's where we're going to find acetylcholine stored in synaptic vesicles. We also will find some amino acids located there too, and a couple of the biggies that we see, glutamate. You've probably heard the term glutamate at some time, right? Monosodium glutamate. Glutamate is is one of the amino acids. There are 20 amino acids. Glutamate is an excitatory amino acid. It particularly deals with learning and memory. And then we see GABA, which modulates excitatory, presynaptic, and inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. So when we have an excitatory situation or an inhibitory situation, GABA is an amino acid that's going to trigger the excitation or slow down and encourage inhibition or slowing or stopping of a transmission. And then glycine is glucose, converts glucose to energy, or helps to convert glucose to energy. We call it myoglobin, the glucose in muscle. So glycine helps, we see glyco there, so there must have something to do with glucose. And then the INE on the end implies that it's some sort of amino acid or a protein, more than likely. So glycine is an amino acid that we see helping convert glucose to energy within muscles. So anyway, another neurotransmitter group. There we go. I don't know what happened there. Okay, neuropeptides. So the last group of neurotransmitters are called neuropeptides. We oftentimes put together a bunch of different amino acids or peptides into chains. We call those polypeptides. So neuropeptides, we often find will really throughout the body, but one of the first spots we located peptides were in the digestive tract. So we do see something called CCK, which we'll look at when we get to the digestive system toward the end of the semester. Cholecyst. So cholecyst, we know, means gallbladder. Kinin is the K. That has to do with movement. CCK is a neuropeptide that gets triggered during the process of digestion. So that's one of the big neuropeptides, one of the older ones that was first discovered to get into the digestive. And then in the brain, we have the endorphins and the enkephalins. So those are going to be opiate receptors or feel-good chemicals. So here's not a complete list, a fairly complete list of different peptides or neuropeptide transmitters. So we're going to see some of these later on in the semester. Angiotensin and bradykinin are big ones that we'll see when we get to the cardiovascular system. CCK, cholecystokinin, gastrin, somatostatin, vasopressin. We'll see some of these in digestive, reproductive. So this isn't necessarily a list that you need to know every single thing on here. But like I say, these first couple, angiotensin, bradykinin, we see again. And then a few of these other ones we'll see throughout. So it's just showing how neuropeptides are activated and the mediators for the sympathetic nervous system response that occurs. So anyway, this is more or less FYI. This is getting into some pretty intense organic chemistry over here. So just know that neuropeptides are going to be located in the brain as well as the digestive tract. And again, the cardiovascular system too. So anyhow, we do see them secreted by themselves. Oftentimes, they can also be secreted as a group or in conjunction with other neurotransmitters. So neuron development in the womb occurs due to the what we call neurotrophins. So again, just a side note. So let's move on to neurotransmitters. A quick overview of cranial nerves. Again, we looked at this in quite a bit of detail last semester, but you want to remember there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. We have what are called sensory and motor aspects, like any other nerve in the body. We do see some mixed cranial nerves that may have both sensory and motor aspects. And then we also have special sensory pathways. So cranial nerves are going to generally be associated with the brain and stay somewhere in the cranium. So we think of the cranium as also having those special senses of sight, smell, taste, and sound. So some of the cranial nerves are going to relate to the special sensory aspects. Other of these cranial nerves are going to relate directly to something more in the line with movement or muscle movement, or sensation, touch sensations, temperature sensations, etc. So anyway, there are 12 pairs. We see the olfactory or the smell pathway coming from the first pair, and then the optic nerve. And again, these color lines are going to show whether it's a motor pathway, so it involves some sort of transmission from the brain out to one of these organs, or sensory, meaning we're bringing information from somewhere else to the central nervous system. So these first couple we notice are blue. So that means sensory is coming in from the nose to the brain. So it's the olfactory nerve that's going to bring the sense of smell to the brain. The optic nerve, same thing there. We see a sensory pathway. So the sense of vision, the ability to see, is going to come from the outside and travel via that optic nerve en route to the brain. Then we see a couple of eye movement or motor branches from the oculomotor, the trochlear, and the abducens nerves. Okay. And then The trigeminal cranial nerve 5 is what we call a mixed nerve. Tri meaning three, so it's going to have minimally three branches. So trigeminal is going to have some of the sensory aspects that we feel along the side of the face, as well as the frontal area. And then some of the motor aspects that are involved with chewing or speech, as well as some of the involuntary motor, some of the aspects that enable the skin and the muscles just under the skin to basically stay in place. So when we have like a droopy side of the face, it could be damage somewhere to one of these motor branches of the trigeminal nerve. Maybe a stroke or something along those lines. Bell's palsy is another one. And we see another mixed nerve, the facial nerve, dealing with maybe some of the more anterior aspects of the motor for facial expressions, wrinkling the brow or raising the eyebrow, furrowing the eyebrow, opening and closing the eyelids. Okay. Again, more of the anterior facial expressions are going to come from the facial nerve. So that's pretty straightforward. We also have some of the sensory aspects as well coming from the face. And the next one, vestibulocochlear. That one we can break down. Vestibulocochlear. That's a sensory dealing with balance as well as hearing. We talked about that a little bit in general. Glossopharyngeal is another mixed nerve where we have sensory coming from inside of the mouth, heading back to the brain, and then motor coming out, regulating some of the epiglottis, some of the swallowing mechanisms, the position of the hyoid as well. And then we have the biggest, longest nerve coming from the cranial nerve section, and that's cranial nerve X or 10, the vagus nerve, which is going to have both sensory and motor pathways that travel out to the abdominal viscera. We also have some of the thoracic cavity viscera, the heart and lungs. So vagus does a lot with regulating some of the basic parasympathetic pathways for maintaining homeostasis, especially regarding heart rate, respiratory rate, digestion. And then the last couple, the accessory and hypoglossals, both having motor pathways dealing with some of the muscles that move the neck, the trapezius, sternocleidomastoids. So we'll leave at the hypoglossal, meaning below the tongue. So again, some of the motor activities that go along with chewing or speech would come from the hypoglossal nerve. So I'm not going to spend too much more time on cranial nerves. I did include some slides that basically break down a little bit more info of what I just went through. So I would encourage you, the PowerPoint by itself will be in the same spot under Module 1, videos and PowerPoints. So I'll put that in there. You can peruse that if you'd like. The next, the third of four objectives in part 2 deals with cerebrum functions. Again, I'm not going to spend a heck of a lot of time here on this one, but I do want to remind you that the cerebrum is divided into 4 lobes. These are the same regions that we've looked at, the same bones of the skull that are associated with these regions. So when we look at the frontal lobe, some of the functional aspects are going to be the personality, behavior, some of the emotional memories stored there, judgment, planning, problem solving, kind of what we call the pre-central gyrus, or kind of where the frontal starts to meet the parietal, but still part of the frontal. We may find the Broca's area for speech. There's a little motor strip of the cerebrum that deals a little bit with body movement. We generally think of the cerebellum as coordinating a lot of the muscle movements, but the frontal lobe also does work with that. And then, of course, intelligence, focus, concentration, self-awareness. So there's a lot of what makes us human. It's going to be located in that frontal lobe. So when we start to work our way back to the two parietal lobes, we see the interpretation of language. We see the sense of touch, pain, temperature. So we're going to see what's called the post-central gyrus, the first section of the parietal where it meets the frontal, is where it's like a somatosensory pathway. Basically, when pain sensation comes up to the brain, a lot of times it is going to go to that area of the parietal lobe. So a lot of that, we looked at the pathway of flow of energy or electricity into the brain, those ascending tracts, those spinal thalamic sensory tracts. A lot of those roads are going to lead right up to the parietal lobe, and then maybe branch out to the frontal. But yeah, a lot of your basic interpretation of what's coming in to the brain: vision, hearing, motor sensory, visual and spatial perception. And then we get to the temporal lobes, more of the side lobes that kind of come forward a little bit on the side of the brain. Of course, we would think of hearing in that area, organization and sequencing, more memory. So along with the frontal and the parietal and now temporal, we do see memory kind of scattered and stored all over the place. It depends on what type of memories, oftentimes. Memory of language is a big one. In the temporal lobe. Again, that's why they say that younger kids, because their temporal lobes are still really developing, they tend to understand learning foreign languages a little bit quicker than adults do, because our temporal lobes and our understanding of language is much more rigid and etched in stone. So anyway, temporal lobe. And then lastly, the occipital, just a small region. This is the visual lobe, or the visual cortex. And again, because of its proximity to the cerebellum, we do get some movement associated with the occipital and the cerebellum. So anyway, last one, pain. This one, in the Padlet, there was a little video that discussed pain. Very good. Pain is something that clinically we're dealing with constantly. In fact, pain management has become probably one of the biggest aspects of what we do clinically. So, causes of pain, treatment of pain, that's pretty much what we're doing all day, every day, it seems like. It's important to understand some of the very basics of pain. I know these are the four kind of like stages of pain that I have here. So, I know these words look kind of big and kind of weird, but I think perception, the last one, is one certainly you've heard of. The other ones maybe not so much, but transduction, transmission, modulation, and perception. So those are the order of pain that we're going to go through. Transduction first deals with activating the nerve endings. So whether they're exteroceptors, so nerve endings dealing with the cutaneous area or the skin, or whether they're more internal, dealing with the skeletal, cardiac, and smooth areas of the body. Either way, we have nerve endings, intero and exteroceptors, visceroceptors for the internal viscera. So anyway, mechanical These nerve endings are activated by mechanical stimuli, heat or temperature stimuli, and certainly chemical stimuli. Nociceptors are the specific pain receptors in those areas. Typically, when there is some sort of any one, by the mechanical and heat are usually more acute, temporary, quick fixes. Chemical sometimes can be a little more long lasting. So anyhow, regardless of what it is, the transduction of the pain or activating the nerve endings is going to trigger a potassium, histamine, and serotonin release by those damaged cells. The histamine triggers an inflammatory response. We're going to get white blood cells rushing to the area. We're also going to get the bottom three there, bradykinin, prostaglandins, leukotrienes. These are all blood chemicals and enzymes. Oftentimes are produced by localized cells or enzymes produced by blood cells that are arriving on the scene. Either way, these are in essence immune system cells. Bradykinin kind of slows everything down, right? Brady means slow. Okay. Kine means movement. In means we're dealing with some sort of a protein or an enzyme or chemical. So in means chemical, Brady means slow, kine means movement. So a chemical that promotes slow movement. Prostaglandins, again, we're finding more information about the role they play in the kind of the anti-inflammatory. So the initial inflammatory response caused by the activation of these nerve endings gets then the tissue that's damaged are stimulated, and that's going to then trigger more chemicals to come onto the scene. So the first thing that happens is these guys get activated: potassium leaking out, histamine leaking out, serotonin being released. All of this is going to happen first. And then once the message gets sent out, it's kind of like an alert siren gets pulled. And then these guys are basically like the paramedics and the EMTs and the police and fire, public safety. They're going to show up and try to kind of put the fire out, maybe slow everything down a little bit, calm the tissue. So anyway, that's the first stage of pain. And then the transmission. So that's what's going on right at the tissue level where the stimulus occurred. And then we're going to carry that up. So with transmission, we need to transmit the information from the damaged site and send it up to the brain. So this is the relay from site of tissue damage to the central nervous system. So we're dealing with the spinal cord then and the brain. So the first spot we go to is the ascending or afferent pathway to the ascending tracts in the spinal cord. Okay, we're going to find the ascending tracts dealing with pain transmission in the antero, so in the front, and lateral aspects of that spinal cord. Okay, the two tracts, the two ascending tracts specifically involved with pain are the spinal thalamic and spinal reticular. Spinal thalamic is going to go directly to the diencephalon or the thalamus, and then go either to the frontal lobe or the parietal lobe. Spinal reticular is going to go through and kind of make a pit stop maybe at the medulla and midbrain area, the brainstem. Okay. So either way, we're going to probably end up in the cerebrum somewhere. The somatosensory cortex, again, that's where we find the post-central gyrus or of the parietal, or just where the parietal meets the frontal. Okay, and then, of course, the frontal cortex. And so both of these areas are where we're going to send the signal of pain. And then from there, what's going to happen? Well, we need to elicit a response. So one of the things that we start with is modulating the transmission. So we get this loud, um, message. We've got a tissue damage at the fingertip. So the brain gets that message and decides, okay, we need to send out some sort of response. So one of the first things we do, it's called releasing of some chemicals, the stimulation-produced analgesia. So an analgesic is a pain-reducing chemical. So algia or algae means pain. AN means without, so without pain. Okay, so stimulation comes in, the brain is going to produce something called spa. Yeah, there you go. That definitely helps to reduce pain. A trip to the spa. But anyway, we do produce some of this naturally. This starts again that descending pathway from the midbrain through the medulla to the spinal cord. So typically modulation is going to occur in that area. Okay, and one of the big issues certainly that we have is trying to handle chronic pain. So a lot of our patients may have some sort of failure of their own SPA or their own stimulation produced analgesia. So then they get prescribed opiates or some other opioids or opiates, something that's going to help to activate the analgesic pathway. So this is part of why the epidemic of opiates and opioids in this country in the world, really, it's a global epidemic, is because pain management has been handled by addressing this area of the brain. Okay, we're getting stimulation in, we get a response out. Well, somewhere in that response area within the brain, we're lacking something, whether it's endorphins, serotonin, maybe getting reuptaken too quickly. So anyhow, this is a big deal. Certainly, how we handle or modulate our pain. Then ultimately, then it comes down to the perception, the fourth stage of pain and pain management. And the three phases or kind of sub-stages of perception are attention, expectation, and interpretation. Attention meaning how much attention are you giving the pain? Is it an acute issue? It's come in and I'm ouch and I'm gonna handle it, put some ice on it, or just handle it. It goes away. It came in quickly, it goes out quickly. Okay? And I don't have to give it a lot of attention, but I do have to pay some attention to it. Chronic pain, of course, involves a lot more attention. It's a lot louder of a problem. So again, how are our patients perceiving this pain? And again, if you work in emergency medical, you're probably dealing with more acute attention versus maybe in a more clinical setting or a GP setting. You may be dealing with more chronic pain situations. So either way, you're going to be dealing with patients that have a multitude of both. The expectation, that's another perception aspect. And again, that's how much will it hurt? So again, in an acute situation, if the patient knows that something, they know when they see a needle and I'm going to give them a shot or draw blood, everybody's got a different expectation of what being poked with a needle feels like. Everyone has it. So it's sort of like your ability to tolerate. It's like a toleration of pain. All of us have the same pain threshold. There's a certain amount of stimulus that's going to trigger the nociceptors to respond. That's what we call threshold. And we saw that with action potentials developing. When we get to a threshold of voltage, we get an action potential triggered. That's the same in all of us. So when someone says, I have a higher pain threshold than you, or lower pain threshold, that what they mean is tolerance. Okay, so pain tolerance differs from person to person. It differs even within the same person. My pain tolerance, early in the morning when I'm just waking up might be different than my pain tolerance when I'm eating breakfast and I'm working, doing activities, or at night when I'm more relaxed and getting ready to go to bed. So even an individual's tolerance can vary from moment to moment. But so anyway, the expectation of the perception of pain. And again, expectations oftentimes based on past experience. So if it's a chronic situation, sometimes the expectation is that it's always going to hurt. So chronic pain is much more difficult to deal with because they've developed an expectation that this is just always going to be this way. So that leads into some of the mental health aspects that are associated with chronic pain. So anyhow, interpretation. So this is kind of where we're at in the clinic, is interpreting and charting what they're telling us. How much does it hurt? And this is where we get into interpretation. This is where we get into pain scales. And remember, perception is different for all of us at any given time. So keep that in mind when you're working with your patients. At the very moment you ask them, on a scale of 0 to 10, where's your pain at today? Or where's your pain at right now? So those can be helpful. They can be somewhat misleading, first of all, because we all have a different expectation. We all pay a different attention. We all have a different tolerance for certain types of pain. So that's very subjective, the pain scale chart. So I wouldn't use it as gospel necessarily. That's what's tricky about pain, is it's very difficult to objectively hook somebody up to a machine and say, yep, this is what they're feeling. This is the level of intensity that they're feeling their pain. So anyhow, and then lastly, under interpretation, what type of pain is it? And this is, again, what you really want to chart. Is it sharp, shooting, stabbing, burning, numb, tingly, whatever, on fire, whatever dull, throbbing, any of these descriptors are what you have to chart when you're discussing pain with patients. So anyway, that's it for module 1, part 1. So the nervous system is finished as far as meeting our objectives for WIDS. And again, if you ever have questions, always please email me with any comments or concerns. So the next chapter we're going to get into, or the next section or topic we're going to discuss, is going to be the endocrine system and some of the hormonal aspects and some of the functions of the endocrine system.